There's tons of moments in the film in which, like tying strings around fingers and ripping paper is part of it. So the fact that you're like, fidgeting over there, it's like, I'm like, you really get it. The film is for you, Tom.
How are you?
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in. And congratulations on the film. I really loved it.
Thanks. I'm genuinely honored to be here and to have people be interested in hearing me talk ad nauseum about everything that went into the process.
When I went to see it last night, I wondered if you came out and talked at the beginning, but do you move on when the film's, can you watch it? Do you watch it with the audiences?
I watch it most of the time, and like Hale County this evening, because it's so, poetic, at least to me, it just meets me wherever I am at my moment in life, even as it changes day by day. I can always watch it.
Now, am I right about this thing that you didn't want, I don't know whether the term is narrative films or fictional films, but you weren't interested in doing narrative. You weren't interested in doing fiction. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting. I could also say I'm not interested in doing documentary. I'm like interested in finding form for ideas.
Okay.
And where they find in terms of the genre of its cultural placement is obviously part of the process, but that's kind of after the fact,
right.
So I'm not thinking about, oh my God, what's my next fiction film? What's my next documentary film? And if I come across an idea or want to manifest an idea and it seems like that's the best place, then I want to do that.
But you weren't coming up going like, I'm going to be a quote unquote filmmaker. I'm going to make narrative films. I'm going to make, these kind of scripted films.
No, not at all. Not at all. I kind of resist that type of direction because it seems to me you then produce ideas that have utility in that space as opposed to being open to the possibility of being multi-genre, for lack of a better way of saying it.
So maybe the best way for me to get this is what happened with Nickel Boys? Like what happened that this was the one you wanted to do?
Well, one was the premise of being introduced to the work with Dee Dee Gardner and Jeremy Kleiner and Brad Pitt at Plan B was that I'd have imagination space. It wouldn't be something in which they were imposing a structure or a way to do it. And then also, after reading Colson's narrative, it's so powerful, undeniably. And I also see myself as the characters. It's a very comfortable space for me to think in. I can just think from my childhood, and those images align with Elwood and Turner's perspective, essentially.
Where did you read it?
I read it, it's a good question. I think I was in Amsterdam doing a screening when I started it. And then I was traveling with Hale County a bit. So, it was probably a part of, the atmosphere of many a different region of the globe. But I think I read it most in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live.
And what were the feelings you were getting while you were watching it? Were you reading it, sorry?
Yeah, I was feeling taken along this strange train ride where I knew it was going, which was a bit of comfort. And then we arrive at, to extend the metaphor, the station, and it's not where I thought we were going. And that was really, really confusing to me. I kind of questioned, at least the second I set down the book, almost all narratives were like flashing through my head, like, have I been reading the world wrong? Did I think that this is true and this isn't true? Because the twist at the end is so unexpected, yet so obvious. It's that Sixth Sense obviousness where you're like, of course it wasn't this, it was this.
Yeah.
And so really comfortable reading it. The story, people know the story of people of color and not people of color going through the world and injustice happens to them and the kind of consequences. It's a mainstay of drama, but obviously the way it's told and the way that it's executed, wow.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I remember the first time I read it, because we had Colson on about it. It was like just before he came out. And I remember thinking it wasn't just the injustice that they go through, but it was like the loss of belief, the loss of hope, the loss of belief in a better world. It was just too devastating for me in that book,
Like it wasn't the type of devastation in which, for probably the worst metaphor ever, someone being in a Holocaust camp where death and destruction is visually illustrated in every corner, right? Like there's no food, there's, rats running around, like everyone is skinny. Like the Dozier School for Boys, it presented itself as a school.
Yeah.
And like how devastating is it to be in an institution that is upholding apparently the values of education and the values of the times, and to be fed food and to be given clothes, however tattered and however spare. But then for death to be looming at nighttime with this fan, or death to be something that is not spoken but known when someone disappears. It's like a bizarre contradiction.
Did you talk to Colson about making it?
Didn't. I emailed him. He kind of chose me with Dee Dee and Jeremy to.
That's nice.
Yeah, he liked Tell County this evening.
That's cool.
Which was the biggest compliment ever. I was
Gotta
like,
be, right?
First of all, he knows who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not that I'm anyone, but that's also cool. And then I sent him an email, and he responded, really tersely and with good luck or something. And so kind of opening it up for me to, I guess, not be pressured by what one would imagine his expectations would be.
Oh, okay. I was wondering whether that would bum you out, but it gave you more freedom.
Well, it bummed me out immediately. But then, because I was like, he doesn't want to talk to me, Oh, woe is me. And then immediately it's like, oh, actually it's kind of freedom.
The film is shot almost exclusively from the perspective of the two young men in the film. Starts with mainly Elwood's perspective and then goes to Turner's perspective as well. I thought that it was going to be something you did to establish the first 5 minutes, and I can see you smiling at me because I'm not the first person to feel this way.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be something you were doing to do like a fun, arty way to introduce the film. I was not expecting it to last the entire film.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that people haven't seen the film yet, a lot of people listening to this, talk to me a little bit about why you wanted to shoot the film that way.
Well, it's funny because at this point in time, I only know how to make films the way that I've made films, while also understanding relatively cinema history and three-act structure and the way that the camera is traditionally used. But after reading the novel, it didn't make sense to do it another way. And while it barely made sense to do it that way, it was the first time I'd read a book and thought about translation. And I don't recommend people reading books with adaptation and translation in mind because you're not, I don't think, truly involved in the literary aspect of it. You're always trying to compare it. It's like ready.
How can I do this? How can I do that?
Yeah. And let that imagination space be at another time. And it's impossible if you're going into the project thinking about adaptation. But I think, and this is also hindsight because the instinct to do it was exactly that, an instinct. And then you can think about why that instinct came. But in hindsight, it's like, how interesting is it that historical characters and historical figures are only and can only be explored from the outside of themselves? Like their reality, their subjectivity, the sensory nature of what it is to be a human in the world is the most universal thing we have in common. It's kind of what, mainly all Western philosophy is based on the idea of self. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And so to kind of bring the camera into the body and to make it an organ, I like to say, for those characters, seems to be maybe the fairest way of exploring their reality in that we're not thinking about them as others. We're not thinking about them as outside of ourselves. We're thinking of them as having the same agency that we have now and allowing them to make decisions from inside their context, not us watching them from our context in their context. And yeah, it's deeply conceptual, but once I wrapped my head around that with, of course, my co-writer, Jocelyn Barnes. Yeah, it was so much fun.
Nana.
Elwood.
Is it also that it allows the audience, like me, the audience, the person listening to this, like the audience member who goes to see this thing, to have a greater sense of empathy, a greater sense of compassion, because they are not watching someone else have things happen to them. They're not watching a black man having things happen to them. They are experiencing it to themselves.
Yeah, I'm smiling again because I think that's exactly it. I stray away from using the language of empathy because I think the way in which empathy is used, all language needs to evolve and change. And I think there's something that's beyond empathy that's more about vicariousness, more about actual coinciding realities with others that is maybe just a new way to explore the same thing we're always talking about. And so, yeah, to me, it's about context, right? Like when we see people make decisions and we're outside of them, we kind of assume there's always judgment. There's always, they should have done this. But in most cases, people are doing the best that they can, maybe ignorant, maybe oblivious, maybe neither of those. but there is something about the world happening and us responding to it as opposed to those things happening at a distance.
I think empathy needs a rebrand because of Instagram. Like that's my
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like compassion and these are beautiful ideas, but empathy got Instagrammed a little bit.
I agree. Yeah.
I tell you, my favorite part of the POV shooting style was almost like not the moments of dialogue and not the moments of action and not the moments of fighting and but it was sort of the everyday moments, like catching that the camera would just be like, or in my mind, like in my eyes through the character, staring at a tree, staring at a pair of shoes, talking to someone and looking off to the side, or feeling uncomfortable while I'm talking to them, so looking at the floor. Those quiet moments are things I don't get to see in film. You're smiling again.
That's because you're just hitting on all of the core ideas of the film.
Well, I'm very smart.
I mean, I don't doubt it, but like you're also philosophically intuitive, and that's different.
I'm also well prepared by people smarter than me is really what it is. But I know I do mean that. Those are my favorite moments. So this sounds like it was intentional.
Yeah. Well, I think about this idea came from my relationship to analyzing general notions of Black representation, whatever that is. Like I'm really hesitant to always use these social concepts of Blackness and whatever to talk about stuff that is so complex, and we squish it down to convey stuff. I would say pretty close to the nature. Well, there's this writer, Michelle Wallace, who says that Black folks' entire relationship to the American project could be summed up by the word consumption.
Consumption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're being consumed, consumption of all these different elements.
Yeah.
And so if you look at cinema, there's something that is squeezed, and because of the industry and the time and how much it costs, like not only are narratives made small, but also narratives are built around the flagship moments of someone's life, and they are dramatic because we want someone to be entertained and we want someone to be emotionally involved. And the focusing of the dramatic and the sometimes negative, sometimes overly positive moments of someone's life erases the majority of life, because the majority of life is
not exciting things happening.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
incredibly banal. It's incredibly mundane, and it is about just sitting in one's own head and following one's own visual and sensory intuition. And so to do that inside someone's life with cinema, to me, just connects it more with what it means to be a human.
Are you a meditator?
Not at all.
Because that's sort of that mindfulness-y thing of I mean that's the world I live in.
Yeah.
Is learning how to be content looking at a tree, learning how to be content looking at the floor, learning how to be content looking at clouds.
I think I learned this from, also there's tons of moments in the film in which like tying strings around fingers and ripping paper is part of it. So the fact that you're like, fidgeting over there, it's like, I'm like, you really get it. The film is for you, Tom. You are the one who is the target of the film.
I mean, I saw that on the poster and I appreciate it. Sorry, go ahead.
Right.
I was talking to you about how sometimes I feel like it takes work to be able to look at clouds.
Oh, yeah.
And,
So I think most of my visual sensibility originates in my sports background. And as a point guard, and who spend a lot of time thinking about the visual field and space and analyzing people's movements to see where you're going to throw the ball, or to see
in basketball.
to see how they're going to defend you and responding, but also moving your body in ways that controls the space while being deceptive and while being illustrative for your team members, while being deceptive for another. To me, it overlaps with photography a lot. Additionally, if you were injured as much as I am, you spend the majority of the time on the bench watching. You're not always in the game. You're mostly not in the game. You're mostly just sitting there looking at the ground and watching from an outsider-insider position and learning through that process. And so the process of looking is just integral, and being patient while looking is integral to my relationship to the world. I did that in Hell County this evening, and it became a conceptual thing where I realized, one, the way that you look at a word and it breaks down based on, you just staring at it too long, and then it recomposes itself, and you're like, oh, that's what language is. The word the is nothing but TH, and T is this and this, but it does mean the. And I was like, oh, no one's ever, I don't mean literally no one, but people haven't looked at the Black community that long enough for Blackness and for these social concepts to dissolve.
To evaporate.
And then recompose themselves in that moment. And that deconstruction, reconstruction became a way of making images. I want to look at it long enough for me to come to all these different conclusions about what's happening as a means of understanding what it's like to be seen.
And you can do that through space. You can do that through the space in the film.
Through the time. And through the organization of the media. And through the space of the film, as you said.
That's so fascinating. I could talk to you about this all day. I think people who are listening to this who have read Nickel Boys, how do I put this now, might be coming in sort of bracing themselves for the trauma undergone by the young men in this in the book and in the movie. I guess the reason I'm sort of nattering around it is because it's nothing in comparison to the actual trauma that these real life gentlemen went under,
Yeah.
But I was sort of bracing myself for how you were going to show the devastating abuse and trauma and torture. Mm-hmm. Can you talk broadly about how you wanted to do that?
Yeah, I'll also say that for those who are hesitant, like the trauma, as you mentioned, Tom, is not visualized as you've seen in any other film. It's just not that type of trauma. I think what's interesting in the way in which we built this film was we were interested in the way in which trauma is built across time and distilled across memory, that how it's sensory. And so hopefully watching the film, it opens up a person's receptiveness to understanding the multifaceted way in which it exists. I remember being in Providence my first year in grad school and living close to the Veterans Hospital and hearing the fireworks and being like, fuck. Oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. Yeah. But what is it like for those in that hospital right now? Like, they don't need anything aside from a car backfiring to completely take them back possibly to that place where they had the most traumatic moments. Yeah. And so how do we use the sensory elements of film in order to just talk about the complexity of it? And maybe that example isn't the best.
No, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think I could further along by asking what you did. Like, what did you do in the film then? Yeah.
Well, one thing we did was we tried to stay true to the source, Colson Whitehead source material, which is the documents. It's called the Dozier document, which is a sort of 50-something, 60-something page research text that explores the items that were excavated and the hide of the boys. And, this kid that was dug up, which is so horrible. And it seems like I'm saying it without, it's just terrible.
Yeah.
He's anywhere from 6 to 12 years old. Like, they don't even know how old some of these kids are. Using a lot of that source material in the film, and in moments in which you would visualize some trauma, falling back to real images of the boys, or alluding to some of the items that were found, which of course then loops the fantasy nature of fiction to the ground and to the real world in an interesting way, which I found is traumatizing, but not in a literal traumatizing way, but more of a psychologically traumatizing way for the audience, where they're like, wow, like, not only was this real, but my relationship to watching a fiction film it's grounded in a reality that I've always been allowed to not necessarily connect.
You can, when you're watching a fictional film, even when it's about a very well-known tragedy or a tragedy that you're finding out about, you can still extrapolate yourself from it because it's a fictional film. But in the moments when Elwood is being whipped and beaten, and when the smack happens, and I don't think I can give this away, right?
It's fine.
When the smack happens, the smack sound coincides with a sort of a zoomed in shot of one of the real kids who attended the school. You're right. It kept me in the film, but reminded me that what I am watching and what I'm relating to did actually happen to somebody.
Yeah. And it's a strange thing because, we need human beings, we live off illusion and abstraction. Like without that, we couldn't make it through the world because, many scientists and all philosophers talk about the world that's in front of us is not the world that's in our head. And people go to cinema for entertainment and for specific types of experiences. But how interesting is it when it's possible to bridge the two? It allows us to just understand ourselves in the world, I think, a little bit better.
I really enjoy watching the film. Can I ask you a little bit about you before we truck on? You mentioned the basketball thing. I find your basketball story really interesting in that you played in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I did.
A place I have spent a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, why so?
Well, I spend a lot of time in Ireland, and I go to the north sometimes.
Okay.
Like that, playing traditional music.
Okay, of course.
What is it like to play high-level, can we say pro basketball, high-level basketball in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, it's funny because it's obviously not the NBA and it's not France professional, but it's professional by fact that we're paid to play, and they recruit 2 Americans from the U.S. to be on their team. And
you got recruited? You got a call to say, hey, you're going to Northern Ireland? You're going to Belfast?
I think Jermaine Washington, who played at Nevada, was recruited. I came to simultaneously work for a peace organization called Playing for Peace at the time. That's now Peace Players International, that uses basketball as a tool to bridge social divides in conflict-ridden regions of the world. So they have something in South Africa, in Israel, in Belfast, Catholics and Protestants. And so I met these guys in Durban, South Africa, and they were like, oh, if you want to work with our organization and you go to Belfast, they have a professional team, I'm sure that you would make. And then you can do both. And that was interesting to me because I've kind of always worked in communities. And so, yeah, basketball's been...
Were you really good in Northern Ireland?
I mean, I remember having a 52-point game.
Come on, you're kidding me, really?
Well, the thing is that, when you play Division I, like I was a scholarship basketball player. It was like, top 100. I think I was top 75 in the nation my junior year. Nominated McDonald's All-American. Like I was a pretty good basketball player.
Was the track for NBA? Was that the track?
Exactly. Like my friend, like I played with NBA players. Like they were I was in that sort of class, and I was on my way. I had the height and I had the skills, and then just like a flurry of really serious injuries stopped me from getting there.
Oh,
but
shit.
I practiced so much and I played basketball so much that I could still compete right now for a fact that my muscle memory is so ingrained, especially at that young age. It wasn't easy in terms of like I had to play hard and play well.
You weren't playing the Generals.
I was not. That would have been fun because I would have been definitely watching them being like, wow, that's cool.
Right. Yeah. Right. Did you put on games between Catholics and Protestants in the North? Did that happen?
Did.
How did they go?
It was more about obviously peace building and bridging divides than it was about.
You're right. It wasn't about who. I wasn't asking who won. I just say what was the experience.
Another turnover, Karen, you're dead to me. You're dead to me.
What was the experience like for you of doing that?
It was. I think it was profound in that aside from the basketball, which and they were mainly elementary school age. Like we took the approach of working with the youth. We did work in the community centers for like that were 13, 14, and 15 and 16-year-olds, but those weren't formal games. They were more like kind of like peace building exercises between community centers. What was interesting to me about doing these things we called twinings, which was bringing the schools together, then eventually having basketball games and camps, was that the bigotry that exists it wasn't the, of course, black and white divide of race in the U.S. It's like, to me, two sectors of people who look the exact same, and they're both white. And white folks, by definition, are like the oppressors in the U.S., quote unquote. And so it's just a big mind twist where you're like, dude, this guy looks just like you. What do you mean his eyes are closer together? Like, what do you mean he smells this way? He's the exact same. And they just swear by these, superficial divides. And of course, the goal of the organization is to use in their country a neutral sport that has
not football, not hurling,
no national affiliation. Yeah. And then allows them to kind of give way to this and then see that everyone's just the same because...
Did it work?
It did. We didn't have, fortunately, hardcore metrics to see because those metrics in organizations that are nonprofits they undermine the task because then you just work towards proving the metrics to get more money. For the most part, at the end of that day, everyone seemed to be friendly, which is something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So to that extent, it was successful.
That's so interesting.
Doesn't take much.
Well, I'm wondering now about the incredible division in this country and in your country. You know, and just hearing about this is, I mean, I'm going to sound glib, but like, I wonder if we just brought curling down to the States and you guys curled.
Probably. The organization's Peace Players International, I think it was one of the State Department in the U.S. was using jazz to like bring cultures together, though it was partially outsourcing American values and like trying to have people like the U.S. because always a secret move.
So hold on, and then photography after basketball?
Yeah.
How did photography enter your life?
Well, when I knew I wasn't going to the NBA in college because of injuries and whatnot, fell into a deep depression and started being like, what am I going to do with my life? So started just reading more and being kind of falling into art making, generally speaking, became fascinated with creative things. And my mom passes away my senior year in college. And so I'm kind of losing both at the same time. My first two loves, as I like to say. And photography was...
Oh, yeah, that's two losses. You lost basketball and you lost your mom at the same time.
Yeah.
Two grounding things in your life.
The most grounding, yeah. And that void was partially filled by photography and photography's ability to give you control over your reality. You get to produce the images. No one can tell you it means one thing. Though they may be right, you still get to determine you have the intent and you have the meaning. And that control, it kind of blew my mind because it made me understand the knowledge production power of images and the way that they could guide, well, specifically replace perception. You know, like if you think about the way that photography and film, for people who don't have access to communities outside of their own, tell you about that community to the best of your understanding of that media, it's pretty devastating, right? Like, all respect to National Geographic as they, compensate for a lot of the ways in which they've outsourced images of the continent of Africa across the world and fed people stereotypes of those places. But, I mean, what is the Black community as it is through the eyes of white folks across time? Hopefully this film shows people, and Barry Jenkins, and like many Spike Lee, like we're talking Melvin Mann Peebles, like there are many artists who have been exploring, the Black community from what one would call a subjective Black perspective. But Nickel Boys, authored by a Black folk, looks extremely different from stock footage of Black folks from across time. And so what's that about?
That feeling of a common humanity and a common understanding seems very important to you.
It's kind of just a mode of working in which I've realized the more that I make images from inside of myself and try to get into specifically what it looks like for me, the more that relates to other people. Yeah. It's bizarre. It's like...
The personal is universal, they call it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's less intentional. It's almost more selfish in a way, like the more I figure out what I want to do, the more someone gets to see themselves in it.
What are if we could play a mind game here, or a thought game for a second, not a mind game.
My favorite games.
Yeah, a thought game. I've been playing mind games this whole time. A thought game. If people are going to, a couple goes to see the film, walking back to the car, going to drive home from the theater. Any ideal conversations that they could be having after seeing it in your mind? Yeah,
I think a conversation with themselves and not with anyone else would be best. Right.
Tell me.
Stay silent for a day.
What do you mean?
Because I think, the film is supposed to spur more questions than answers, in the same way that hopefully someone goes through a portion of their life and they have, the wisdom to look back and critically analyze the way in which it unfolded, the relationship between their experience, what was actually happening, what do they want to get from the moment, and what was the moment actually telling them? What was it like for someone else in that moment? I think making films in a way that aren't directing someone to have a very specific experience, aside from one that's experiential, especially in the context of someone else's life, opens that person up to the complexity that is the real world and is what it is to be a person in the world, though we think we understand what's happening and we think we understand what's going on. We do, but only as it relates to the way that we've been conditioned to understand those things. There's an infinite ways to access a moment, but as human beings, we need to find meaning and we need to make sense. And living in someone else's shoes to the best of that ability and going through their experience, like, what do we think was going on? What are we judging about that? What are we assuming? What are other ways of looking at it? Hopefully, people converse with themselves before. I mean, I know it's hard conversing with someone else so that they're not overly guided in the way in which we're overly guided.
This is a really fascinating chat, man. Thank you so much for coming in.
No, thank you, Tom. Like, been genuinely fun. I mean, not that I didn't expect that. I mean, you are Tom Power.